Hello and welcome back to An Old Man Watches. And today I'm going to be talking about the Blake Edwards 1965 comedy The Great Race, which starred some big stars of the era: Natalie Wood, Tony Curtis, Jack Lemmon. And the movie itself is set in the early 20th century, so probably 50 to 60 years before it was made. And Curtis is playing the Great Leslie, a heroic daredevil. Leslie is always dressed in white, he's handsome, he's ever courteous, he's enormously talented and successful. His nemesis is the malevolent Professor Fate, who is the traditional melodramatic villain, usually dressed in black, sporting a black moustache and top hat, glowering at almost everyone, possessing a maniacal evil laugh, filled with grandiose plans to thwart the hero, and eternally dogged by failure. As part of their ongoing rivalry, Leslie proposes an automobile race from New York City to Paris, going overland the whole way except for a short ferry ride across the Bering Strait from Alaska to the what was then Russia. And for this race, both men design and build new cars for the event, and several other vehicles also enter the race, but Professor Fate and his minion Max manage to sabotage all of those outsiders except for one, beautiful photojournalist Maggie Dubois, played, of course, by Natalie Wood. A world-spanning race and many, many slapstick antics ensue as the two men and the feisty ladle battle to be first across the finish line. So director Blake Edwards was riding high in the mid-60s off the back of multiple hit comedies such as Operation Petticoat, The Pink Panther, and the famed Breakfast at Tiffany's. So when he set out to film the greatest comedy ever, quote unquote, with a cast of big names in the lead roles, he didn't have much trouble getting studio buy-in. Even when the movie's escalating costs caused United Artists to drop the project, Warner Brothers were more than happy to step in and approve every remaining cost overrun as the movie's budget soared to $12 million, which is about $115 million in today's money, and made it, at the time, the most expensive comedy ever released. Despite the money and talent invested in the film, however, it would be a critical and commercial failure, the first of Edwards' career. And honestly, I think the failure was entirely deserved. So let's talk about how and where I think this film went wrong. So Edwards, who co-wrote the story as well as directing the film, was a great admirer of silent cinema, and I'm a big fan of some silent film myself. And Edwards dedicated this film to the comedians Laurel and Hardy, and he liberally pillaged the silent era for its visual gags and slapstick elements. And he didn't just limit himself to rummaging through the earliest days of film, though. The film contains a great many time-worn cinema scenes from all the eras of film to that time. The ballroom brawl of a western, the sword fight of a swashbuckling adventure, the laboratory of the mad scientist from a horror film, and so on. Edwards also did a straight-up parody of The Prisoner of Zenda to fill out the film's final third. And then there's a recurring motif of "push the button, Max," which is what Professor Fate always shouts just before his later scheme to defeat the Great Leslie misfires in some extravagant way. It's like a live-action version of Wile E. Coyote futilely pursuing the Roadrunner, and Wile E. Coyote was around by this time. The end result is that much of the film feels, frankly, a bit tired and overly familiar. And I get that to some extent the familiarity is the point, but a comedy script needs to do more than just kind of go, hey, remember all these things were funny in other movies? Isn't it funny if I repeat them? Because the answer to that, it emerges, is not as funny as you seem to think. Now, the most famous scene in this movie is the pie fight. It took 5 days to film, and in today's terms it cost nearly $200,000 just for the pastry, let alone all of the other costs of filming. Brightly coloured pie fillings were used to enhance the visual impact, and for continuity between days of shooting, the actors were photographed at the end of each day and then made up the following morning to exactly have the same smears of pie crust and filling. This whole scene is another example of Edwards referencing earlier cinema, in this case a pie fight in the Laurel and Hardy film The Battle of the Century. It's also an example of another flaw of this movie, which is the script always seems to overdo things. The pie fight in The Battle of the Century used 3,000 pies. This film uses 4,000 in a scene that at 4 minutes and 20 seconds is at least twice as long as it needs to be. In short, it's a scene that's bigger than the original, but not better. And this whole more is better problem, or philosophy, which becomes a problem, is writ large in the film as a whole. At a whopping 2.5 hours long, the movie runs far longer than it needs to, belabouring its limited store of jokes well beyond their expiry date. It would be a much better film if it was a good 45 minutes shorter and exercised considerably more rigour in what it chose to keep in its runtime. And then we come to the final flaw that I'm going to talk about, at least, which is that a hero is only as good as the villain they overcome, and on this front, the great Leslie has a real problem. As honest and good-hearted and noble as he may be, or at least as the film claims him to be, the script tells us he's this, because there's definitely times his behaviour doesn't actually match the claims, Leslie's not an especially interesting or memorable hero because his adversary is so entirely lacking in substance. In fact, given how completely and inevitably every one of Professor Fate's schemes backfires upon him, it's hard not to start to sympathise with him. Yes, much of his misery is ultimately self-inflicted, but he's so universally Fate's whipping boy that his overall bad attitude is pretty understandable. What's regrettably less understandable is Fate's specific grudge against Leslie himself. Is it just that they're rivals in the career of being professional daredevils? Is it that Leslie's just so handsome and popular that Fate is consumed with jealousy? The film's never going to bother to explain. They're just enemies because they're enemies because they're enemies. Professor Fate is an empty cipher of a villain without any clear objective other than to defeat Leslie, and no clear motive even for doing that. The conflict in the film is thus inconsequential and irrelevant, which makes it hard to care about the income. When it comes to being entertaining cinema, The Great Race falls short of the finish line. Next time, the dystopian science fiction martial arts mashup that is 2002's Equilibrium. But that is next time. Until then, thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.